There's a clock right over there. I figured that out in yesterday's panel. I don't have to run my timer here. Let's see. U.S. judge strikes down Andrew claims. Battle rages for Yemen Ghost City. Russian nuclear submarine on fire.
All right. I guess so. Thank you for coming. May I have your attention, please?
Tortured G8 prisoners.
May I have your attention, please? Thank you so much for coming. This is panel number 2761, How the Authorities Lost Our Trust. Today is Tuesday, April 7th, 2015, and it is exactly 3:30 p.m. My name is Marcy Miller. I'll be the moderator for this panel. And as a matter of housekeeping, please make sure that your cell phones are off. Since we can all take advantage of the internet and Google any of our panelists, and we can also look at the very comprehensive bios in the conference guide, I asked each of our panelists to just give me a quote. And here they are. Our first panelist is Richard Argood. And he said, I reinvented myself twice and I didn't like it. Our second panelist is J.M. Parker. He said his first job after college was on the Hill during the Watergate era, and it was Woodstock compared to the Washington, D.C. of today. And our third panelist has not arrived yet, but he'll be here, and so I'll just tell you what he said. The people who will help you don't always look like you. And that's a quote from Leno Rose Avia. So without further ado, our panelists.
Thank you. I saw this crowd. I was afraid the Beatles had reunited or something. I'm not used to this many people. Mike, how's that? Better? I can't get any louder. You know, I think for a person my age and maybe 10 years younger, there is one continuous event in which we lost faith in what anybody said about anything. I don't believe what any political figure says about anything because I personally revere Wayne Morse and Ernest Greening. Do people realize why I revere Wayne Morse and Ernest Greening? They were the only people who didn't buy the bullshit about the Gulf of Tonkin. The Gulf of Tonkin. I can't get any louder. I'm talking as close as I can to this. Can you hear me now? If it had a trigger, I could blow my brains out with it. It's not only did the president inflate a report by a rookie sonar man, they even made up a second incident. None of that happened. And upon that is the entire justification for the heating up of the Vietnam War. Now, the Vietnam War, we have to remember, was invented quite some time ago when we were stupid enough to help the French save their colonial empire, which is pretty hilarious in retrospect. It all started, Harry Truman lied about the Vietnam War. Eisenhower lied about the Vietnam War. John Kennedy lied about the Vietnam War. If you're looking for a common denominator here, it's lie. Now, I read my Neustadt and my Kissinger when I was in high school. I know sometimes great leaders cannot totally tell the truth. But I think in American history, you see a continuum. The Pentagon Papers covered our activity in Vietnam from 1945 to 1968. 1968 is when Walter Cronkite decided he wasn't for the war, so everybody else said, oh, us too. In 45, we were allies of the Viet Minh. And I don't know, maybe somebody told him that Ho Chi Minh was a communist. I don't know. But they didn't care when he was cleaning up Japanese forces in Vietnam. The deliberate deception started with Truman and continued and accelerated. The question was domestic politics, always. Never a moral position. We killed hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese. Hundreds of thousands. Things like Operation Phoenix killed at least 40,000 people in about a week. The thing about Lieutenant Calley and My Lai is that it's almost an accident that they picked that one out, because there were plenty of others to pick out. They lied to us about that. The reporters called the daily briefings in Saigon the 5 o'clock follies, because nobody believed a word of it. We must have killed everybody in Vietnam 8 times over, given the body counts. The body counts themselves were lies, and they were based on lies, because if we killed somebody, that was a Viet Cong. So we just killed more people. That way we could count more Viet Cong. The 64 campaign, Lyndon Johnson promised, it's one of the few times I really quote William F. Buckley, because he said, they told me in 64 that if I voted for Goldwater, the war would be escalated and we would dive into a morass in Asia. He said, and I did, and that's exactly what happened. They were right. But Johnson, we may recall, both ran as a peace candidate. I got a quote here, which is really kind of funny. I won't send American boys to do the fighting for Asian boys. He was in the process of drafting the orders. Anybody remember the Daisy ad? The little girl counting down from 10. That's one of the early take advantage of how stupid the media are kind of ads. Because I think they ran it once on the network, but it ran on the news like hundreds of times because the news people thought it was cool. Well, that was threatening that the other guy is going to get you deeper into a war at the same time you are actively working to get deeper into a war for domestic reasons. Johnson's own tapes show that he was deathly afraid that the Southerners would turn on him and accuse him of cutting and running in Vietnam. He knew what was the right thing to do. He knew it wasn't getting anywhere. He knew he was playing the political versus the human cards. 68. Very few people believed Richard Nixon when he said he had a secret plan. What Nixon had done was start withdrawing American ground troops so that the pressure at home would lessen. In the meantime, bombing the living hell out of North Vietnam. Daniel Ellsberg claims that he did indeed have a secret plan. I always doubted that until I read what Ellsberg said. Ellsberg said his secret plan was to go to peace talks with the Viet Cong and threaten them that he would escalate even farther. That was Nixon's secret plan. We didn't know about the increased bombing of North Vietnam. We didn't know about bombing in Cambodia and Laos. They deliberately lied about that. Among the lies, and people still buy this one, the idea that those evil commies in Vietnam are going to keep our guys as prisoners. There are always lots of people missing after wars. Wars are messy. They kill a lot of people. And they kill a lot of people in places where they can't be found. They still find an occasional body from World War II in the Philippines. You find some poor guy sitting in his P-40, 50 feet underwater. Nixon played that. Sylvester Stallone played that. I don't blame Stallone much, I don't think that the movies have to tell the truth. I do blame Nixon, though. Nixon knew. There are not now these days 70-year-old Americans tilling rice fields in North Vietnam. I don't have any proof of that, but I doubt it very seriously. We dropped 3 times the amount of bombs on North Vietnam that we dropped in all of World War II. Now just think about that. The Dresden firestorm, all that stuff, 3 times as much for Vietnam. I don't remember knowing that, and I was intimately involved because I was fully convinced that these people were out to get me killed. Anybody remember celebrating your 26th birthday? I celebrated mine because it meant I didn't have to worry about my lottery number anymore. Part of the lie today, we have professionalized our armed forces, which is a good idea, but it also takes the pressure off the policymakers who send armed forces into danger. They had pressure in Vietnam because there were people there who didn't want to be there, who wrote to their mothers. The heat's off. I don't think we've stopped doing stupid interventions. After Vietnam, we did Grenada. Does anybody know what that was all about except a really bad Clint Eastwood movie? Panama, we were going to unseat a dictator. Well, we got into the dictator unseating business. We'd never stop. There are certain United states, I live in New Jersey now. I think sending troops to unseat Governor Christie would be a great idea. But I don't want the U.S. Army to have to do it. Iraq, false pretenses. We know that now. We didn't know that then. Afghanistan, it probably made sense for a quick intervention, not to stay forever. What was that great movie with Connery and Michael Caine? The Man Who Would Be King. It's what happens when you go into that part of the world. We don't learn anything, I guess. Smedley Darlington Butler, one of my favorite all-time characters. He was a Marine Corps general. He came up with all kinds of ideas. Whoops, that's my bell, but I'm going to finish the story. Including having a gigantic traffic lights on the top of Philadelphia City Hall, so all of Broad Street would use the same signal. It didn't work. But after he got back from his duty in Central America, he described himself as a gangster for Wall Street. Gangster for United Fruit. Maybe governments don't have to tell the truth, but I think ours in the last 50, 60 years has gone beyond that. All right, thank you very much.
Let me introduce J.M. Parker.
Thank you. That's it. That's enough. That's fine. Everybody hear me? Okay. Let me begin with my standard disclaimer that the opinions I am about to express are my own and not those of the U.S. government or any U.S. government agency. I hear some of you chortling out there. You've heard me before. I take kind of a longer view on this, and I'm sure it has to do with me being an academic. When did we stop trusting leaders? I think we stopped, the first sign that we stopped trusting leaders was back in the garden when someone said, "What do you mean we can't eat the apple?" As you look at the evolution of governance, moving towards some form of democracy, moving away from kind of tribal arbitrary rule, one of the recurring themes that comes up again and again is this question of trust. How far should trust be given? How absolute must it be? Are you in a governed relationship essentially saying, I give up all my rights and my freedoms to demand certain things because you are providing me with the minimums for security and survival, and therefore the dictator can do whatever they want based on their assumption of what is the common need. And over time, that proved to be not always the best way to to govern, not always the best way to move forward and evolve. And it is something that's common to every society and every historic era that I'm afraid of. Boy, that was a Freudian slip. Every historical area that I'm aware of.
Works both ways.
Works both ways. It does, actually. Maybe I should stick with that. Okay, let me ask a question here. How many of you here have read, and no cheating, not those who just heard the bumper stickers, but how many of you here have actually read Machiavelli? Okay, how many of you have at least heard of Machiavelli? We'll go with that. Okay. How many of you here have read the Arthashastra or have heard of Kautilya? What are they teaching in colleges these days? The Arthashastra was a document written by a Hindu holy man, or a Jain, actually, holy man, for a ruler of a particular part of what later became India, that was actually written about 2,000 years before, or a little less than that, before Machiavelli wrote. And as best we can tell, Machiavelli had no awareness of this document. But the writings are remarkably similar in that one of the things Kautilya, this advisor, does is talk about the responsibilities of the leaders to the governed, that the king's greatest interest is what his people's interests are. It is very detailed in the responsibilities of having a trustworthy, non-corrupt government that operates under the rule of law. And interestingly enough, the king that he advised actually ended up ruling all of what became modern India pretty well and pretty efficiently. So this issue of whether or not we fully trust leaders or whether we should instead put in place devices that ensure that the leaders are being watched and that we never fully trust them is rooted deeply in history. And again, this is something that recurs. Cromwell came along and said, "Don't trust the king." Shortly thereafter, everyone said, maybe we shouldn't trust Cromwell. Probably the most vivid example of this is the evolution of American democracy. The writing of the Constitution, the history of just the process itself, is an interesting exercise in wise individuals, at least those who were thought to be wise and among the best at their time, saying, we can build a democracy, and I trust you to work with me to build that democracy, but by the way, okay, I'm watching you. We're going to put in place institutions that ensure that no one has too much power one over the other. The Federalist Papers, which I know they still teach in some colleges, is an extraordinary piece of work where basically a government has to go out and sell itself to its population before the Constitution could be adopted. And one of the selling points was, we know government can't be trusted. We know individuals who have been given leadership and power, whether because they're doing so out of good intentions or whether they're doing so out of evil intent, need to be watched and need to be checked. What happens again and again, though, is the kind of an extension of that theme. If the rule is that we have to have a system that is aware that this is going to happen and we need to watch individuals, then we all as individuals need to be aware that we also in turn need to watch the system. Leaders tend to do what is something in the best interest of all of us when we are actually watching, even if it's not something they necessarily wanted to do. If you look at the historic evolution of the civil rights movement in this country and start, say, with Little Rock, when even though Eisenhower was very much in favor of the idea of leaving authority to states, when Eisenhower actually called out federal troops to enforce Brown versus the Board of Education. And when governments were not being watched, when the assumption was, well, there's a law and there's a system and there's a process and therefore everyone will be taken care of, things don't turn out so well. Let me kind of wrap up here with one of my favorite works that kind of illustrates this idea that you can have all these great principles, you can hold yourself out to be a democracy, and you can root your actions in deeply held beliefs, but that does not mean that you can take your eye off of what you're doing and what your responsibilities are. At the start of the Peloponnesian Wars, Athens was what we hold out today to be this classic example of what eventually became modern democracy. And at the end of the first year of that war, as was the custom, Pericles, who's often hailed as the first great democratic leader, held a formal ceremony in which they gave tribute to all of those who had died in the war in that past year on behalf of Athens. And he did something really extraordinary. Rather than hailing the individuals for their individual bravery, he talked about Athens. He talked about what it was they died for, what democracy meant, that others could take actions because they were told to do so, and that those who were citizens of Athens acted even when they knew the worst possible consequences were coming, but did so with their eyes wide open and with a belief in something greater than themselves. It's probably one of the first, most articulate, and to me, most moving descriptions of what a democracy should be. But that's the same Athens that over the course of the Peloponnesian Wars swooped down on a small island called Milos, and basically said you can either subject yourself to our rule and to virtual slavery, or we will destroy your island. It's the same Athens that, in an aggrandized sense of its power, its role, and its right to rule, set off on a disastrous expedition to Sicily. And the eventual conclusion of all this was the collapse of Athens, the end of democracy. And frankly, if you carry it just a little bit forward, a nation of people of Greece who did not again enjoy independent rule for over 1,800 years. In sum, the process of trusting leaders is one that probably we should question as a premise or as an assumption. And it was, in the words of either Thucydides, who chronicled the Peloponnesian Wars, or Bob Dylan, I'm not sure which, don't look to leaders, watch your parking meters. Thank you.
Our final speaker is, Leno Rose Avila.
You'll let me know when I'm running out of time.
I will.
Okay, good. I wish I could remember the quote exactly. George W. Bush said, "Fool me once," and then he sort of got lost. And I think he did it. George Bush did it, yeah. But Dan Quayle did a lot of other things. So he was fooled 3, 4, 6, 8 times. Does anybody ever remember Ernie Pyle? Ernie Pyle, if you ever read Ernie Pyle's stories from the field in World War II, it's the most graphic and humane presentation of a difficult time for American soldiers and American combat in a really difficult war and under difficult conditions. And I always admired when I was in college reading what Ernie Pyle and risking his life and being in the foxhole with our soldiers and really telling it as it was, and we had good reporting then. And then we had even somewhat good reporting during Vietnam when our soldiers could be out in the field and shoot pictures. And we got a story, and that's what they didn't want. They didn't want to see the young Vietnamese kid running down naked down the street after napalm and Agent Orange, and they didn't want to see those pictures because the American people might get a little jaundiced about this great war that we were conducting in East Asia. And then we got into the Gulf Wars. Reporters never saw the war. They were like in a television studio getting feed that the American government would give them. One of the things that we're really missing in America is getting the news. We don't get the news. And don't fool yourself just because you turn on the Sunday talk shows. Those hosts will not ask the tough questions because their guests will have threatened not to come back on the programs with them. So they're not asking them. If you look at all the news bureaus, they have cut back on their investigative reporting because it's a little bit too much money. But that's where we really brought out the questions, about really what is going on? What is our government doing? And I think because of that, we need to talk about how are we going to get the news and get the truth, because we can get it out of our government. We can get it out of the news. There used to be a law that if you presented one side, you had to present the other side. And then they amended that law, which I thought was crazy, that, that you couldn't, so people can get on the air and say their news. And there's one program that has an animal name to it that says they're the news. And I wouldn't mind if they just said, we're an opinion column, which is okay. You can do that. But to say you're a news program and to promote it as such, and for so many Americans to be fooled by that. I used to go on a lot of military bases and different government institutions. That'd be the only thing that was playing, was that channel. And I said, really, I can't get the Daily Show here. The Daily Show has better news than the regular news, and a more challenge to it. And Colbert and everybody else who's doing that with the comedy sense. The other side said they got so jealous of the comedy programs they were going to create their own comedy channel. Good luck with that. It's been 5 years. You got to have a sense of humor to have a comedy program, right? But I think the real question, even with Googling and going on the internet, and I don't trust any one newspaper. Just because I've been in the field and I've seen stuff covered, human rights in Guatemala, Nicaragua, and all of those places. And, and I know how our government lies about those places. I was in Nicaragua the last 9 months of Somoza, an awful dictator. He killed a lot of his own people, and we supported him up until the end. And our government was lying to us. Our CIA was lying to us. The military was lying to us. And when I went in as a Peace Corps country director, they said, and I knew because I did my own independent study about who Somoza was and the Argentine military junta who was torturing people, making them disappear, Chilean government, Pinochet, nothing that the news was giving me here, but that I had to extract from other sources. So there I am, my first week in Managua. The war's going on in November of 1978, and the embassy calls over to the Peace Corps office and they said, would you like to come and meet President Somoza? That's the protocol that we normally have. And he takes a picture with the Peace Corps director. And I said, well, I don't think you want to do that with me. And they said, why? I said, well, I don't want to have a picture with Somoza. And they go, why not? And I said, well, I got to be honest with you. If I get that close to Somoza, I may want to choke him. So don't take me. Here's a man who's killing people all over his own country. Not that I was choke him literally because I'm non-violent, but I would think about it very hard. I think, there's a lot of reasons we don't trust our government, because they lie to us and they're controlled by big corporations. The decisions coming out are by big corporations. I'm just going to walk you through a little bit of 9/11. Remember 9/11 when we all came together? We were attacked, 3 airplanes, and then immediately we decided we were all unified in our defense of our country, honor it, and then the lies began with weapons of mass destruction. Our media that we trusted and everybody else, except a few, challenged that were their weapons of mass destruction. And, they got on television, they went on the United Nations, they made fools of themselves, and some of them still say that there were weapons of mass destruction. And then they honored, our soldiers, our first responders. If you're one of the families of the first responders who got ill by all that dust and asbestos, and then for the U.S. Congress to deny you the full benefits of what you deserved, and to argue about that after saying that we're defending the first responders, something's wrong in America. And then for our soldiers to come back and be only because the families of the soldiers fought like crazy people, did we start to recognize PTSD. It wasn't that our government said, no, we're going to heal you. You're our fallen soldiers. We honor you, because there was this whole movement, honor them, bring them up in the baseball game, the football games, do all these ads, honor our soldiers. You want to honor them? Protect their lives. We've had so many suicides from soldiers that our government could have prevented. That's why you don't begin trusting them. Then, on the immigration side is they started wholesale going after Muslims, and a lot of us didn't speak up when they were arresting them and terrorizing them here in other parts of the country, and then we opened up Guantanamo. And the American public has never protested enough about the torture that was done there. How can you believe our government that we're going to defend our soldiers when they're picked up by an enemy country, and we're going to say, don't touch them because they're American, we're somehow special, but we can torture people? And then they got on this hysteria, which I thought was kind of crazy. I didn't know where it came from, and I've done a lot of immigration work, is that they had to deport all the Latins from America. They got in this big deportation because the terrorists might come over from Latin America. So I would say, well, how many planes were flown by Latin Americans? And they started building this wall and deporting us by the tens of thousands. There even was a rumor on this news channel that has an animal name that Al-Qaeda was going to arm Mara Salvatrucha, which is one of the big street gangs, with weapons of mass destruction. They were going to come over. And this is my idea of a gang, because I work with gangs a lot in El Salvador. Gang members look like gang members. The most identifiable people, they're not going to take orders from Al-Qaeda. I could just see them coming over, they lean back, floppy pants, and they go, hey, Jorge, you got the things I told you? Yeah, man, I got them. You sure you got the rocket launchers? Yes, I got them. Okay, let's go to Boulder. So they got us to fear everything. Remember, they were worried about cows coming over from Canada that might have a bomb or crop dusters? I go, how stupid are we? Now they have us taking our shoes off. Next thing they'll have us taking our underwear off. The first time they got into this real invasive, because they're creating this fear, and we run with it because we're afraid. So the first time they had this invasive, where they pat you down in your groin area and your back, and the guy said, well, I'm going to have to get kind of personal. I'm going to pat you down in your groin area. You okay with that? I says, yeah. Go ahead. I don't want to miss my flight. But I said, but if I get real excited, can I hold on to you? Because you never know what's going to happen. The other thing that our government lies to us about is what is in our food. I've been working on GMO issues in Oregon and Washington, California, and the GMOs, seeds and foods that are produced that way, have elements that we should not be consuming. But because the corporations, Monsanto, Syngenta, Bayer, and others, buy into our politicians, so they let pass bills that would allow for these crops to come in. And one of the things you have to understand, if our government they've just authorized new pesticides in the last year that are worse than DDT. Remember how hard we had to fight to get DDT off the shelves? We got even worse. 1 minute, or is it?
1 minute.
I thought she was throwing the finger at me, so. Which has happened before. And I was going to ask her that the number of your white parents. But I think one of the things that our government never told us was clear about Agent Orange. They weren't clear about DDT. They weren't clear about tobacco. We had to push them. And we really got to be thinking about the pesticides that they're approving in ag and EPA and other places. And we have to fight for the protection, not only the farmers, the farm workers, the consumers, but also the environment, because it's damaging all of it. So you got to raise your voice and you got to be informed.
So we're going to open it up now for some Q&A. Students, remember, have priority. So if you'd ask your questions from the microphones here on either end of the podium. And also, please ask questions. Don't make speeches. Come on up. They can if they'd like. Would either of you like?
It sounds to me like we don't have a whole lot to fight about. If I could recommend one book to anybody who wants to understand these issues, it is Philip Knightley's The First Casualty, which will let you know why governments like wars, because wars give them excuses. They give them, we're doing this for the boys. They don't care about the boys. They prove that with the VA. We can't let them die in vain. They're already dead. The war was in vain. What are you trying to tell us? The Knightley book takes you from the beginning of war correspondence all the way to, I think, to the first, or the latest edition is the first time in Iraq. It just shows how bloody efficient governments have gotten in keeping you from knowing what is going on. The difference between Vietnam and the Falklands is astonishing. Nobody knew what was happening in the Falklands. I was just filling time while you guys came.
All right. Why don't you ask our first question, sir?
As we engage in the difficult task of placing ourselves properly on the spectrum of trust and distrust, don't we have to be wary of oversimplification? Thus, although Vietnam was a catastrophe and a nightmare, wasn't it the Brits and the Dutch that really pushed us to support the French, and there were some arguments they could make? And weren't there people who genuinely believed in the falling dominoes theory, thus Eisenhower urging JFK to get us involved in Laos?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the problems when you have an event, a Gulf of Tonkin or 9/11, where the most easy and most dangerous mistake to make is this just came out of nowhere and we had no idea this was happening. The history of our decision to move into Vietnam beginning in 1945 was very well documented. And it was discussed and debated in public. The Geneva negotiations in 1954, the willingness of Ho Chi Minh to accept a continued protectorate, all those kinds of things were well documented, but they got overwhelmed by what were perceived to be a bigger threat. One of the things that you mentioned earlier about Johnson being haunted about being turned on for losing Vietnam was the legacy of what happened with the fall of China in 1949. And politicians in both parties and at both ends of the political spectrum were terrified of being caught in a revival of what happened after that event, the height of which was the run of Senator Joseph McCarthy in the United States Senate. What strikes me again and again with so many of these things is that the information actually is there. Increasingly, it's available. The counter information on WMDs, all those kinds of things. But what we tend to do, and when we, and I include myself in this, when the public reaches the point where they trust the government just a bit too much, is when they're ruled by fear. And when they're ruled by a change that is beyond anything that they can kind of see themselves understanding or fitting into. And they cede powers and cede responsibilities that they should not. And there are great people like Morrison Gruening, but not only in our own history but in others, they're too few and far between. The irony is we now live in an age when we have access to more information than we've ever had. I mentioned something in one of the earlier panels about getting a briefing on the internet as this new thing that we were all supposed to start using. And someone gave an example of a website and just kind of randomly pulled up this website for this organization called Al-Qaeda and this guy named Osama bin Laden in 1997 with his declaration of war already posted on it. Well, don't tell me on the 12th of September we had no idea this guy was coming. My least favorite moment in the 9/11 hearings was when former Secretary of State Condi Rice was questioned on the intelligence that was provided in advance about a particular memo, and of course the questioner knew what he was asking about, and she said, I believe the memo was titled, Bin Laden Determined to Strike in the United States. So the big error in my mind when these kinds of crises happen is when everyone, out of fear or what have you, said we had no idea. There's no way we could tell this coming. No.
Just one thing on Domino's, and that's why we had so much U.S. intervention in Latin America, because they said if Chile falls, then Argentina, and then, comes up through Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and all of that. And we just had to remind them that sometimes we play checkers, we jump over one country and go to another one.
Jay said something very important. All that information's out there. One of the greatest reporters in Vietnam was Izzy Stone. He didn't go to Vietnam. He didn't do a lot of interviews. He just read all the paper. And the paper is there.
Thank you.
I can't classify everything.
Next question, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Jameson Nelson. I'm a senior of International Affairs Studies here, and I'm a senior in International Affairs Studies here, and a United States Marine veteran who's had to deal with the VA administration. Had to stare at Fox News in my chow hall for 5 years, even after asking if we could just turn on cartoons,
That was cartoons.
Yeah. No, and when you brought that up, that actually tickled me because they won't turn it off. I could ask, and there was no turning it off. When the presidency changed hands from George W. Bush to President Obama, Fox News was still on there, but you could actually, at that point, I could ask to change the channel, and they would change the channel at least.
If I could just interrupt, that was one nice thing about being a full colonel. I could get up and turn off the TV.
That sounds very nice. Yes, sir. So my question as far as losing faith in authority that we have, I don't like to actually get involved with that. This party was in charge. Now this party's in charge because in reality, I feel that no matter who's in charge, the United States, the people of America have lost a little bit of faith in people in positions of authority. Freedom of Information Act is a big tool, and you're saying that information's out there, but there's a lot of secrecy still, and as far as information that the American public would like to get, and I guess I just wanted to kind of start a discussion with, as far as without it becoming partisan, how are we getting the American public more engaged in the news without it becoming this is an extreme right view, an extreme left view of everything, and you're in this group or you're in that group?
Thank you, sir.
Well, one of my approaches would be is that on our Sunday shows and all our shows, we should really have people who are of different opinions and really have a dialogue and represent America. And the other thing is that I got to tell you, you going through the Veterans Administration is you have to be a whiz person to be able to figure out all the forms, and if you have PTSD, you're never going to get through there. But the other part is that when you, and I've done a lot of FOIAs, and it's not as easy as you think, that you fill out your FOIA form and you're going to get it. And if you eventually get it, and sometimes you have to file several times and do pressure, is everything's going to be redacted, so it looks like a black piece of page just about when it comes out. Because I asked for a FOIA on me, and half of it is black.
And our ex-Marine friend is correct. The Obama administration has been worse at classifying stuff than the Bushes were, and they were pretty bad. Also, you mentioned the Sunday talk shows. One of the regulars, one of the guys who was on last week, was Rick Santorum. Why the hell is he on TV? I mean, the guy lost for re-election in Pennsylvania by 26 points. Nobody loses by 26 points. He's lucky they didn't send him to prison. And there he is every Sunday nattering with that idiot, what's his name? The new one, Chuck What's-this, or I don't get it. I think we have to be much more selective in what we watch. I mean, I don't watch network news. I'll watch the BBC, I'll watch Al Jazeera, I'll watch NHK, the Japanese network. I mean, I think we have to start getting selective. We have to start letting the American networks know that, dog and pony pictures aren't going to work for us anymore. And we don't care whether Rick Santorum is alive or dead.
Thank you.
I think one of the interesting kind of sidebars to this has been, I think there's no other way to describe it, the full-on collapse of television news over the last 15 years. One of the ironies, I used to teach media and politics, and one of the fun lessons to teach was this idea that most people got their news from television. I mean, this is just an article of faith. It's like, the Vietnam War was the television war, even though less than 1% of all the footage in the war had anything to do with violent actions. So the surveys would say roughly 85 to 87% of the American public get their news from television. Interesting. Let's go to the Nielsen's and find out how many people are actually watching television news. And the people who are watching, and by this I don't mean sitting all the way 30 minutes through and taking careful notes and cross-checking the facts, but anyone who turns in for, what's the Nielsen limit? It's something like 2 minutes or something, if you basically flip the channel long enough, was less than 37%. 37, I was never good at math, but there's a disconnect here. People were when grilled in more direct and more in-depth interviews, were talking about news, information, and news stories that could only be traced back to fictional television, that could be traced back to commercial advertising. So the percentage of people who, I'm increasingly convinced, the longer I live in D.C., that really the only people who watch the Sunday talk shows are the people who are on the other Sunday talk shows. It's a very self-referential forum, and enlightenment is not the main thread there. But again, and this is to repeat something I said in another panel, I kind of agree on the idea of being selective. I made a point of watching Canadian broadcasting very early on in the Iraq War, just as one example. But increasingly, what has happened with the increase of information is individuals will gravitate to news and information sources that confirms their pre-existing attitudes and beliefs. I am not so worried about Fox News because, frankly, almost everyone who watches Fox News pretty much believed all they heard before they tuned in. And you can say the same thing about Pacifica News. You can say the same thing about any other news source. The problem is that unlike in the well into the 50s and early 60s, individuals do not read multiple news sources. They don't seek out information that might disconfirm their deeply held beliefs. And, to come back to a common theme, they allow their information searching and their information acceptance to be driven more by fear than by a very important level of curiosity.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Hi, I'm Tyler Maperga. I'm a freshman here. As a young adult, we're constantly surrounded by mainstream media. What are some ways we can inform ourselves with the truth without going straight to the source and finding it for ourselves?
Well, let me put in a plug. I keep hearing from the volunteers for CWA that one great source is to work as a CWA volunteer, and then you get to question old guys like me. What did you really mean by this? That's one technique. So if you haven't filled out your dance card for the next 4 years, volunteer for CWA. What I found, interestingly, is that younger people who are more media savvy do find a lot of these sources many times before I do. But one of the problems, and this is as much, the people who know neurobiology, I don't understand what they're saying, but I have to kind of nod my head, tell me that part of the problem is that with so many information sources, particularly younger individuals, almost literally hardwired, do not watch stuff in depth. And so while your generation, I've been impressed, has constantly drawn on a wider source of information than my generation, they don't go that deep. Whether it's the apocryphal, what's the first Google site I find, or whether it's something that's a very complex issue, I'm going to read the first paragraph and go on. So I don't think this problem is always the source so much as it is gathering from a wide net, looking in depth, and cross-checking what you read.
Yeah, I think the depth is a piece of it. Jay mentioned the CBC. I watched this when I lived in North Dakota. I watched a CBC documentary on what's the flying Swiss Army knife that Charlie Kurski, the disastrous fighter plane that they keep adding stuff to.
That's an Air Force thing. I don't pay attention.
Good. Well, they sold it to Canada, and there was a half-hour documentary on just what went wrong. And I feel as if I understand that plane, and I understand what the Canadian government did, and I understand the issue as far as Canada's concerned. I know nothing about the U.S. Air Force buying the bloody thing, but I do know the Canadian Air Force made a serious mistake.
Well, one of the things that I think you need to challenge yourself to is, in addition, one of the papers that I read on the internet every morning is The Guardian from London, because even they cover some race issues better than the U.S. does, and stuff about different groups. And the other thing is that I've signed up for some listservs from some very different, they sort of lean this way, and I get their news because I want to hear, I'm open to argument. I'm open to information. And I also, so one of the things that I learned when I was in college, I don't go to listen just to speakers who affirm what I already believed, but I would go to listen to other people, because you have to understand where people are coming from, whether right or wrong, if you ever want to have a discussion and be able to come to a middle ground. And I think you have to do that. If you're only listening to the choir, you're not really going to be grounded in all of the information that you need. Because even if we demonize one group, political group that we don't, we're going to find out that on some piece of the agenda, they're more rabid than we are. And so you got to get to those points. You're never going to get it unless you start a dialogue or start listening. So I don't think there's all good or all bad on either side.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Brianna Wiesar. So I just have a question kind of about democracy. So democracy is all well and good, but do you believe that the way that our Western society has capitalized on freedom as their way to conquer, do you think that that's comparable to the fall of Athens?
Let me do Knightley a little bit now. I think that politicians in the major Western democracies have learned to manipulate democracy. The fear stuff works. It worked for Bush. It worked for Netanyahu. It works for anybody. You scare the crap out of people, they'll go out and vote for you. I think what our obligation is to avoid being manipulated. I don't think democracy is dead, but I think PR has really taken it over. I mean, you compare, and once again, I'll do Knightley. You compare the PR effort the U.S. government had in Vietnam and in World War II with the current stuff, it's night and day. It's that much better. I mean, you get some colonel standing there pointing at a screen watching something blow up. What do you know about it? You know what he tells you. I think we've entered into the era of public relations, and that has compromised democracy in serious ways.
One of the things, and I don't want to cast dispersions here, but I'm guessing you've got a paper or an exam coming up on classical political systems. Commendations. I wish I'd been smart enough to do that when I was an undergrad. No, not to get too much into the weeds on Greece, but one of the interesting things about Athenian democracy was it was increasingly more and more representative, and it had some really phenomenal checks in it. Everyone was rotating through these key offices, and you were audited like every 10 months in great detail. And there were ways of ensuring that people didn't get too entrenched in power. What began to happen, and this is at least my interpretation, particularly as the war went on, and the war was used as a rationale for many things, particularly when the war was going bad, was the participation increased, but the checks did not. the institutional and process checks to determine the accuracy and honesty and integrity began to kind of erode. You began to see individual figures who were very good at exploiting public fear, at advancing their own agendas, began to advance. And yeah, the Greek example is not totally perfect, and the analogy can be stretched sometimes. But the problem itself was not so much the idea of democracy, which can be interpreted in so many different ways and is represented by so many different forms of government that are structured at least ideally to be a democracy. The problem is, are there institutions and processes in check that are impartial, where everyone is subject to the same rule of law, and most importantly, where citizens take their responsibilities and duties as citizens seriously? Everyone is aware of the results of the last two off-year elections. What was the percentage of people who actually turned out to vote? How many people actually paid attention at that level? So that to me is the issue.
One of the concerns for me is that the lack of voter participation, as you were talking about, is that we have a very low voter participation, and especially amongst youth and people of color. In addition to that, we have a number of states that are passing bills to suppress voting. And that is the most undemocratic issue that we have at this time, because we're going back to the times of Jim Crow, where they're trying to keep people from voting. Instead, we should be trying to figure out, and they do it on a fear thing, that there's illegal voters going to the polls. And every time you study it, maybe there's 1 out of 2 million. And it was not a real organized threat that they were going to take over the polls. And we need to vote. Countries where they've had to fight for their vote in revolutions vote. We have to take a big concern and take back the vote, and all of us. So the group that needs a lot of credit are people over 50 because they vote more regular than the rest of the population. But we got to get everybody voting, reasons to vote, candidates they believe in, issues that they believe in, and then we're really preserving democracy. But when 20, 30, 40% of the eligible voters vote, that isn't a vote. That isn't a consensus. So if you're not going to vote, the Constitution allows you to do public assembly. Then for God's sake, go out and assemble and demand something. But you cannot be silent in a democracy.
Thank you, sir.
I'm Hans Miesler again, and to put this into context, I am a Vietnam combat pilot. Since my return back in '72, I have written many letters to my senators and representatives. I find that my letters nowadays get less direct response as each year goes on, and I find that extremely frustrating. And the other formats that we've watched, that's always been an indication of the people. They say we need to be involved. Well, when we are involved and we get no letters back, responses to the questions or whatever the discussion was, that is very frustrating. So we're being stonewalled. And short of having demonstrations again like we had during Vietnam, I don't see that happening right now. And I'm getting very frustrated when I send Doug Lamborn a letter saying, I don't think you're doing the right thing, and I get turned off. So how do we change that, please?
I mentioned in the Sex and Power panel, have you noticed that all over this country, legislatures are passing laws to regulate women's freedom? That's what they do for a living. Well, the reason that the Indiana attack on people's rights got turned around is that it became clear to corporations and the politicians they own that there was a price for doing that. I mean, they have to perceive that you're going to hurt them. And the one thing that a politician wants to do is continue to be a politician. And you notice in Indiana, NASCAR turned around, Walmart turned around. We're not exactly talking left-wing organizations. And they turned around because it was bad for business. we have to make things bad for business, and we have to scare the hell out of our elected representatives. I mean, it's as simple as that.
One of there's kind of an interesting phenomenon. As was mentioned earlier, my very first job out of college was on the Hill in '73. And when I compare the size of personal staffs and the level of experience of individuals on those staff and the attentiveness and time that members have to put into things like constituent letters between now and then, it's shocking how much it's decreased. The size and the pay has been cut. Members are increasingly reliant on think tanks, on lobbyists, on interest organizations. But one thing I will say that I have noticed, and friends who still work on the Hill will confirm this, if you write letters, a lot of times they won't respond because they get a lot of letters that say the same thing, and it's, well, maybe it's one of those, auto kind of things that's being generated by one organization. When 2 or 3 people show up at their office and demand to meet with their elected representative, they tend to pay attention. When they come back to, and they spend a lot more time in the districts now than they did when I was working on the Hill, when they come back and people start showing up for town meetings, they pay attention. I mean, part of the genesis of the Tea Party movement was organized efforts to get people to community meetings that congressmen were having. And people of other points of view or moderate points of view didn't show up. And that got action.
Sir.
Hi, my name is Luke, and I come from a very conservative town. So first off, I'd just like to say, if we're going to go after Fox News, can we go after MSNBC as well, just for the equality?
Sure, go ahead. It's not an exact parallel, but
yeah.
MSNBC is noted for being incompetent. Fox News loads the dice.
No, you have my deepest sympathies if you do. But so I am in high school. Currently, I'm a junior. And my generation, a lot of what I hear is that politics is just a rigged game. And so you can vote either way, but it won't matter because you lose either way. And so if we don't have faith in our political system and that we can get our voice heard and that we can change things, what is the process that we should go through to make change so that we can actually live in a democracy?
One of the interesting phenomena over time, this is a very good question. One of the interesting phenomenons, I'm old enough now to have seen different phenomena come back 3, 4, and 5 times, is periods of time where people really sincerely believe their vote does not count and it does not matter. What's interesting to me is how that tends to go on for a long period of time, and then somebody or a group of people just say, that's it, enough. And the one example I remember after the frustration of the late 60s and the early 70s was in about 72, 73, people started to organize and say, we're going to start doing stuff. And you had what was known in Congress as the class of 74. They came in, turned around. Mickey Edwards, if you haven't heard him speak in this conference, you should. They came in, turned around the entire system, fired as voting members of their caucus when freshman congressmen were supposed to be seen and not heard, and rarely seen, fired 3 very powerful ranking chairpersons and passed a whole host of legislation, a lot of which was in the wake of Watergate, about government accountability, but a lot of which was environmental legislation, stuff that related to human rights. And it was very, very effective. And whether left or right in this country, or even when it's happened from the center, there's a point at which a generation or a group have said, we've gone along saying enough that our vote doesn't count. Let's organize and, number one, find individuals, ideally from our own group, who are willing to step forward to vote for, and let's get out and vote for them. And when that happens, it's truly transformative. It doesn't always happen enough.
Yeah, and one of the things about 74 is it built on the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam movements. The structures were there. People had worked very hard to prepare 1974. It didn't happen by accident,
So in Seattle, we took a little bit of different approach about 2.5 years ago, and we voted in the first socialist on city council. And it shook up everybody on city council because she didn't play the old boys games and wouldn't go along with all the lobbyists that were coming into city council. So sometimes you got to figure out how to shake them up. One time here in Colorado, when I was doing voter registration in San Luis Valley, they in redistricting, they put a Democrat and Republican, both conservative, in the same district. So we asked the Democratic Party that we just wanted 3 votes on agriculture, and would the old boy Democrat vote with us. He didn't. We got him off the ballot because he did a rule, broke a rule in county election, and he had to run as a write-in. We ran a cowboy. We pulled off a horse against him, and he still won. And then we ran our attorney, who was Anglo, and we had done voter registration, and we allowed the Republican to win because it didn't matter to us. We were going to get the same kind of vote. And so the Democratic chair told me that I was dead in Democratic waters, and I said, I was never part of the party, so how could you get rid of me? And a year and a half later, they called us up and said, who would you like as a candidate? Sometimes you have to hit the political system between the eyes with a 2x4 because they don't want to listen.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm curious if the panel has an opinion or a theory on what we could see as a future. If, in my opinion, I imagine our fractional reserve system under the Fed to be an inevitable crash. So I'm curious as to what we could imagine to see after that, and if that's even your opinion as a panel that we could eventually see a crash. I'm sorry. Again,
a little bit closer.
I apologize. I'm curious if the panel has an opinion on a future of what we could see after what I imagine to believe the inevitable crash of our fractional reserve system under the Fed, and if you even believe that it could eventually come to a crash.
I personally know nothing about the dismal science.
I appreciate it.
In fact, I could have been a Republican senator. I know so little about it.
So I think that you've stood in line for a long time and that none of our panelists are really...
I was just curious. I know we were talking about obviously being in the dark about a lot of these systems and the way that they operate. So I was just curious if we may have an opinion here.
I mean, you raise an interesting point, and it goes to something that was kind of triggered by the earlier question about voting not mattering. What's really interesting in government and politics, to me, is how everyone pays attention to a presidential race or a Senate race or a congressional race. The frustration is getting people to turn out for a city council race or a state legislature race. The state legislature is the one that determines what your congressional districts are going to be. They determine what the laws are, and as Mickey Edwards was saying in a panel yesterday, there are actually 4 states in this country now that have an election system that does not allow someone who only got like 2% of the registered voters in a primary to vote for them to advance to the ballot. And if you have a race where the top 2 vote getters in the primaries are Democrats or they're both Republicans, they're both going to the general election. Those are the kinds of things that come up from the state legislature. At the other side is those agencies that are boring, mind-numbing, the whole reason why my generation avoided economics classes in droves, where there is a surprising amount of information in the regulatory system, and nobody really pays attention to it. If you want to see how you can affect change and really do it in a way that directly matters, look at what Leno's doing on food additives and stuff. I mean, the FDA can be, I mean, that's sleep-inducing material, reading that stuff, and it's not as sexy or exciting as a presidential race. And I don't agree with your assessment of the Fed, but it's one of those things where there's so many institutions and processes out there that demand, and I would go so far as to say, even expect public input. And when they turn for it, all they hear is crickets chirping. So whether it's the Federal Reserve, whether it's clean water, whether it's food additives, whether it's how well or ill the DMV functions, that oftentimes is where you should pay the most attention, where you pay the least attention, but where you can have the biggest impact?
I think on the feds that's one of the institutions we know so little about as the common people, and they make such major decisions because they're determining the rate of interest. And my concern has always been, are they determining the rate of interest to help the common homeowner or taxpayer? And most of it I see going to benefit big business because thinking that it's going to trickle down to the rest of us. But the Fed has amazing power and influence in our economics, and it would behoove us to track the decisions that they're making and raise our voices about that.
I think also, the Fed, in comparison with some of the issues we're not knowing enough about, is minor league. I mean, I would have never gone to sewer and planning board meetings had I not been paid to go. There are fewer and fewer people being paid to go to those meetings and tell you what is going on. You're going to have to go for yourselves and be bored as stiff as I was all those years ago. Because that, talk about the impact at the lower areas. The 1964 rout of Barry Goldwater revitalized the Republican Party because they started organizing at the lowest levels possible, school boards, all that sort of thing. Well, all those people start climbing the ladder. You're going to have to, as citizens, we're going to have to, get down. I mean, things like planning boards have an influence far beyond all of these big-time things we worry about. They're going to tell you, this guy's going to put a fat rendering plant right next to your house. Well, that's a little more dramatic.
Thank you, sir.
You all mentioned lying politicians, and I can't imagine any of us wouldn't like to have honest politicians and elected leaders. During the previous president's administration, the weapons of mass destruction is an obvious thing that bothered a lot of people. And by the way, Leno, the quote was, "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me, you can't get fooled again." That was the quote. One of the things that I heard during that painful administration, painful for me, was an idea that I thought was brilliant, and I'd like your opinion on it, and that was that just as when we are in court and we swear to tell the truth, when we swear in an elected official, we add the clause that when they're speaking publicly or officially, they need to be telling the truth or it's perjury. Do you think that would help, and do you think it's possible?
Well, it would be entertaining.
I think what you need is a room that's because I think we have the technology now that's emotion sensitive, so that when you're in the room and you start lying, all the red lights go off, and then and your nose gets bigger. That'll really tell it. So if you're a politician, we're going to give you this hormone every time you lie, it gets bigger.
Well, let me give you an example. It's not exactly an example that I would give in normal circumstances. But the Republican Party has spent the last 20 years promising the anti-abortion people and the religion people they're going to give them everything they wanted, and those poor fools believed it. And the thing is, they're going to lie to you. You got to look at them and figure out, what are they really telling you? All the Republican Party is telling the people of Bob Jones University. Wasn't that a great name for a school? Telling the people from Bob Jones University is we're awfully sympathetic. Well, the people at Bob Jones, they got a program. I mean, it's not my program, but it's there, and nobody ever does anything to bring that program to fruition because it's terrible. Everybody would hate it. But, we the people have to look at our politicians and say, is this really believable what this guy is telling me? Should I listen to this guy? Or is he totally full of it, which I suspect?
We have one more question we had to get to her. So.
Yes, she's been waiting a long time. Thank you.
That's all right. Thank you very much. Thanks for this great panel. It's very informative and wonderful.
You say gray or great?
Both. What I was wanting to ask you is if you could comment a little bit about whistleblowers today, such as Assange and Snowden and Chelsea Manning, in relationship to the topic of this talk? Because to me it relates a lot, and I wonder if they're going to be more and more, or do you think coming down on them as hard as politicians, including Obama, have come down on them, that it will dissuade them from speaking out? And I think it's kind of a direct result of us not trusting the authorities. Thank you.
The one sad thing about whistleblowing, and I've witnessed a couple of these up close, is that many times the biggest problem is not so much the lack of laws protection or the lack of formal institutional protection. It's the colleagues and the peers who work with these individuals who fear for their jobs, who fear for their who don't want the boat rocked, and in some cases they're deliberately pitted against the whistleblower. In some cases they act on their own. I mean, you all, I'm sure, know the story of Silkwood and what was going on in Oklahoma. And yes, a lot of that was direct corporate policy. Some of it was just acts by individuals who felt that their position, their security, and even their identity was being threatened. Yeah, it has never been easy for whistleblowers, but I think, and I think that's one of those things that requires some greater legislative strengthening, and not sure if the political climate is such that you're going to see a lot of initiative on that, but it's something that frankly has been a problem in Democratic administrations as much as it has been Republican administrations.
Yeah, and
governments, people, corporations don't like to be embarrassed.
Yeah, that's the whole reason for classified information, by the way. Somebody who screws up is going to be exposed. But I think it's a direct comparison. I used to do union organizing. And I always tell people, the law says you can't get fired, but you probably will. You know, and the law says you have these rights and these rights and these rights, but you probably will have to fight for several years to exercise them. And I think that's the curse of a whistleblower. You never know who to trust. The statement about, you know, your colleagues are going to be opposed because you're rocking the boat. You know, whistleblowers rock the boat. Ellsberg was chased around long before he did his triumphal tour of American colleges, where he got more sex than he could dream of.
So we have.
He was pretty much maltreated by everybody.
Questions.
Yeah.
So we have just a couple more minutes, and we have a couple more questions. So let's.
Yes, I'll try to be brief. I was wondering if we can perhaps end on a more positive note. I think we're all aware of the problems.
The guy behind you.
Yes, but I'm in the middle of a very excellent book, Bully Pulpit, by Doris Kearns Goodwin, and the problems that were in New York City, the Roosevelt, a Republican uncovered, and the antitrust and so forth, they were horrible. And our question is, aren't we, haven't we solved some of those problems? Can't we be positive about where we're going and be positive about what happened?
Lena?
Well, my thing is I think that we always make progress, but we have to keep working, because otherwise they start taking away our progress. So it's not a job. It's never a finished job. Democracy is not a plant that you can leave alone. You have to water it all the time.
Last question.
Hello. Is it working? Okay.
Yes.
So the one question that I really wanted to pose is that in multiple cases, especially in small-scale legislature, we've seen changes that then influence larger-scale things. And one of the things that I specifically wanted to ask about was instant runoff voting, and if you believe that that would allow third parties to become more prevalent in the current political situation.
I think it's worth a try, and I think if that change is going to come, as an example of the way the electoral laws have changed in 4 states here recently, it will come from the legislatures and from the local governments. I believe you're right.
I think we have to make it much more easier for third parties to raise their voices. I was part of a third party here a millennium ago called La Raza Unida, which was a Chicano party, and I was a candidate because I thought we ought to be able, and to get on the ballot was so onerous that it discourages you. But I think, other countries have had multiple parties. They survived. They have a wonderful time, just as wonderful as we do. And but so I don't think, for me, and I was a hack for the Democratic Party nationally and worked for the chairman of the party, but I'm not wedded to the idea that there's just needs to be 2 parties in America.
And just one final note on that. One of the interesting things about third-party movements and about candidates who fail spectacularly is that while their agendas may not be advanced and may not even be given credibility, if you follow them forward, say, another 10, 12 years, you would be amazed at the number of things that were considered crazy or fringe ideas that suddenly find themselves into the agenda of major parties. So it's a matter of getting the process started. And if third parties can do that, and historically they actually have in this country, I mean, the Republican Party was once a third party that was anti-slavery, then that's a positive step.
Good point.
So thank you very much for coming, and please thank our panelists.
I wondered what we were going to talk about when we got here.